So, increasing the concentration of CO2 is linked to an increase in global temperature. Some things are going to be affected more than others. Coniferous forests, for example, are very highly affected, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. The warming is also going to affect a geographic distribution of precipitation. Here is the link between CO2 emissions or CO2 presence in the atmosphere and temperature on Earth. So these are actual measurements that people have been able to get starting from around the 50s here up until slightly before present time, maybe 10 years ago or so. And they're showing you that there is a clear increase of temperature, and that correlates very strongly with an increase of CO2. And this does appear to be strongly linked, but you are a clever scientist and you say, well, correlation does not equal causation. So let's look at some more evidence that these two elements are in fact paired. Just as an aside, if you see the blue line, which is CO2, why, can you think about this question, why do we see these peaks, this cyclic activity go up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down? I'm not going to give you the answer, but think about it. Okay, so that was a connection of CO2 and temperature that was the last 50 years or so. Can we see this link go back in time? So this is a map just showing you just temperature, and they're showing you many models measured in many different ways. So how do we measure temperature in the past? And all of these different studies have figured out different beautiful ways of estimating temperature. So one way might be to look at the rings of a tree. So if we know that trees grow better when it's warmer, we might see that the rings are farther apart when there were warmer years. So that might be, for example, one way that we estimate temperature in the past. Here are all the different studies, and we can see that there is a range of temperatures that these studies have, but in general, there is a pattern when we look at all of these studies together. So we do see that they show some of the same kinds of fluctuations. So, for example, all of these studies see this dip here and another dip over here. But in general, the range is pretty good. So this is the range of upper and lower limits of temperature. And then starting around here, we have actual temperatures. So this is real numbers that we were able to measure. So follow the red line, we can see that here is 1,000 years ago to today. We do have fluctuations, and that's normal to have changes in temperature on Earth, but most recently we see this change go up very, very rapidly. So that's why people are concerned, because normally we do have fluctuations in temperature. However, recently we've seen very, very rapid changes, and that is not something that people have seen before. So this can have unforeseen or foreseen consequences on living organisms. Here is a map of an increase of temperature over time. So where are the regions that are most affected by changes of temperature? So in blue, we have regions that will have a decrease in temperature up to 2 degrees. And in the warmer colors, we have regions that will experience a larger increase of temperature. And we can see that the increase in temperature is somewhat located in the north. So we saw in the previous slide all of these models of what temperature used to be over the last 1,000 years. And we want to link this increase in temperature or these temperature fluctuations to CO2 because we want to conclusively say that there is a connection between the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and the temperature that Earth experienced. So how do we see what the CO2 level in the atmosphere was over the last 1,000 years? We can take cores of ice, and so here's a picture of a core right here that this scientist here is holding, or whatever he is. And they can actually see how much carbon dioxide is dissolved in the ice, and they know how old different levels of ice are, so they can estimate the age of the ice, and they can say, well, this area here is 1,000 years old, and they can accurately measure the CO2 that's dissolved in that ice. And that's how we see how much CO2 used to be in the atmosphere in the past. Okay, well, now we have estimates of temperature and we have measurements of carbon dioxide. So what is the correlation between temperature and carbon dioxide? So in blue, the blue line, we have the temperature and its deviation from present values. So 0 would be, I guess, the average of Earth today, and then up here are temperatures that are warmer than present, and down here we have temperatures that are cooler than present. And then here we have atmospheric carbon dioxide. So let's just focus on these two elements of the graph. We're going to ignore this upper panel because it's not directly relevant to what we're talking about today. But let's just look at the blue and the green. So they're showing you that these two lines that follow each other quite closely. So every time there is an increase of carbon dioxide in this green line, we also see an increase of temperature. And these are termed interglacial periods, so these are times that are not ice ages. So we see that these two values here are quite closely correlated. So here's the carbon dioxide go up again, here's the temperature go up again. And again here, right, and this peak over here, and this peak over here, and then they go down similarly. So carbon dioxide presence in the atmosphere and temperature on Earth are and have always been very, very closely linked. So that is, to me, pretty conclusive evidence that an increase of CO2 in the atmosphere will in fact lead to Earth getting warmer. And if you pay attention to the time scale that we're looking at here, we're looking at very, very, very long time scales. The point of this piece of data here is to show you that the estimates that scientists have made are pretty accurate. So in the purple line is the direct measurement of temperature over the last 100 years or so. So we've actually just started using thermometers and we've measured temperature, so we can see that that is the temperature that we are experiencing on Earth. And they're showing you that if we use other methods to estimate temperature, so some of these methods are discussed in your SimBio module, and I expect you to know what they are. If we look at these indirect methods to measure temperature, such as the tree rings, and we estimate the temperature, we see that the indirect measurement and the direct measurements actually follow each other very, very closely. So this gives confidence to our model and our ability to predict what the temperature was in the past. We also can predict what the temperature will be in the future based on these models. So here's California, where presumably you are residing, and let's look at a projection of the temperature over time for the next 50 to 100 years. So here's on the left is a map of the temperature in the past, and they're using this heat map that shows you cooler temperatures in purple, and then somewhere in the comfortable zone is about blue or green, and then when temperatures get very warm, they turn into these red colors here. So over the past, about 30 to 60 years ago, here was a distribution of what the temperature was like in July. In 10 or 20 years, it's going to look like this. So a lot of regions have become more red. The red regions have spread out. So it is going to get warmer. And then if this continues on the same track, then the temperatures are going to get really warm, and a lot of regions are going to get into this 100+ range that we're looking at. So I think that we can conclusively say that we are increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The increase of carbon dioxide is and has historically been very closely linked to an increase of temperature. So what is going to be the effect of rising temperatures on Earth and its ecosystems? One obvious outcome is going to be a reduction in the amount of ice on Earth. So our polar ice caps are present on that north part of our globe, and they do change throughout the seasons. So in the summer they melt, and then in the winter they regrow. However, if we look at the amount of ice remaining after, if we don't consider that variable amount of ice, we do see that these polar ice caps have shrunk over time. Let's look at a quantification of that statement. So we can look at East Antarctica, West Antarctica, the Antarctic Peninsula, and some other regions, Greenland, Antarctica, etc. So this study, published in Science in 2012, looked at the area over time, and they're showing you that, with the exception of that green region there, that all the other regions that they looked at are actually getting smaller. So they're looking at the mass of the polar ice cap, and they're showing you that just over 15 years of time led to a pretty significant reduction in the size of the polar ice cap. The melting of all of that ice, as well as other factors, will lead to the sea levels rising. So here's a measurement of the change in global mean sea level in that green line there. So there is actually a measurable increase in sea level that we are seeing. And if you live near a coast, which most of you probably do to some extent, maybe you have a house on the beach, but maybe not. Maybe your house will soon be near the beach. So when the polar ice caps melt, there is less water is stored in the ice cap. More of it goes into the ocean, and sea levels do rise over time. So if you are on that island there and sea levels are rising, those shores are going to be underwater pretty soon. Here's a graph showing you essentially the identical data. This graph is from your SimBio module, so I just wanted to throw that in there as something that will look familiar later on when you're working on that module. If we look at rising sea levels and we consider an area that some people are familiar with, so New York City here, it's showing you a map of what is going to be underwater if the sea level rises by 10 feet, by 30 feet, and so on and so forth. So you can see that the effect of rising sea levels by 30 feet, which is, may or may not sound like a significant amount, is going to put a lot of areas near the coast underwater. Another element that global warming is going to affect is weather. So in your SimBio module, you're going to talk about precipitation and how increasing temperature leads to more water evaporating from bodies of water and going into clouds into the atmosphere. And that water will come down again, presumably at some point, through rain. So global warming is going to increase the amount of rain that we have, but it's also going to increase the severity of the storms that we experience. And you can read more about that if you are interested, because I'm not going to necessarily discuss it here, but it is kind of an interesting topic. So why do storms increase in severity when the temperature rises? All I can tell you here is that they do. This graph is showing you that over time we have an increase in the annual storm count. So that's showing you here in this black line. Let me show you the time scale momentarily. So we're looking about to 2005 here. So around 2005 we really saw a large peak, but we do see, if we look at the 5-year average in this red line here, we do see over time that the average storm count is increasing. And if we look at the linear trend, the running average, there is some increase, but we might not have progressed far enough into far enough to be able to confidently say that there is an increase, a very strongly correlated increase in storm number due to climate change. So again, this is a phenomenon that has just begun. Over time, we're pretty confident that we will see this correlation, but for now, all of this data is very fresh, and there might not be enough yet to prove that this is absolutely what is happening. There is going to be a big effect of global warming on living organisms. So you can imagine that if temperature has such an important effect on organisms physiologically, that they are going to need to adapt to their environment or change environments when temperatures change. So this is a prediction of beech tree distribution. And in red is showing you the current range of the tree distribution, and in yellow we're seeing the predicted range if the temperature increases either 4.5 degrees or 6.5 degrees. And part of this is conjecture, so scientists are estimating how much the distribution of trees will change if the temperature gets warmer, but part of it is also known to have occurred in the past. So when we saw that graph of temperature over the last 100,000 years, we know that temperature fluctuated pretty dramatically over time, and during those times when temperature increased, we do see from the archaeological records that certain types of trees migrated northwards. So this is something that's happened in the past. Right now, the same thing is happening, so we do see some species of trees moving northwards to climates that they're better adapted to, that are more like the climate that they are used to. However, like I mentioned before, because temperatures are increasing at a much more rapid rate, we are concerned that organisms are not going to have time to adapt to the change in climate that we are experiencing right now. What other effects does global warming have on your local environment? So there's an increase of warming and wildfires. And this is kind of like the storm data, so it is a little bit fresh and we don't have possibly enough data, but there is certainly an emerging trend that over time, if we look at this top graph right here, if we look at global temperature or local temperature and then the number of wildfires we do see a correlation between increased temperature and the quantification of wildfires that we see at least on the west coast. Global warming is going to have an effect on agriculture, so here are some different ways in which the warming of the climate will affect agriculture. Upon changes of temperature, a lot of organisms might not be able to adapt and will die off, so we'll see a loss of biodiversity. Sea levels will affect shorelines, which are important for agriculture. There's going to be more extreme weather, so more storms, more droughts, more of all of the extremes. There will be longer growing seasons, so you can think about how that might affect the ecosystem. That might sound like a good thing, but of course everything is linked to each other, so when one good thing happens, we might think about some negative outcomes of that as well. There's going to be a lot more pests. So for example, mosquitoes are usually killed off during the cold climates in a lot of parts of America, but if the winter becomes warm and it doesn't kill off the mosquitoes, there's going to be a lot more movement of vector-based diseases through the area. So we're not going to get rid of those diseases, those disease-carrying insects during the winter. They're going to persist throughout the year. So CO2 is the cause of global warming for the most part, and we know that it's a big problem. So what are some things that we can do to reduce the CO2 in the atmosphere? The simplest way is just to initially stop putting as much CO2 into the atmosphere. So in the previous modules, we talked about different ways in which we can modify behavior collectively as a society to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere. We're also working on ways of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and putting it back into the ground where it originated. So They're showing you here in this cartoon different ways that we're working on. So how do we sequester CO2 from the air and put it underground? That is a very interesting question. Here it's showing you some CO2 scrubbers that will collect CO2 from the atmosphere and sequester it. They're showing you that hopefully we will be able to pump CO2 from a rig into the deep ocean or into rock layers underneath the seafloor. But of course, these are all energy intensive practices, and the easiest way to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere is to prevent it from getting there in the first place. So we can slow down global warming by reducing our energy needs and converting to renewable sources of energy. And of course, this is going to require an international effort. So hopefully this will happen in the future, and hopefully we all will support this happening. Thanks for listening.